So I've warned Susan that, as usual, I'm going to make her work hard, and I'm going to make all of you work hard as well, because I like to get some information from you. First of all, if you would, please put in the chat what stakeholder management means to you. And in addition to that, please feel free to put in the chat any issues that you have or that you're concerned about or your objectives for today so that we can share those. Now, I'm going to ask Susan to tell us what people have said in a minute, but first let me share with you what I see as the objectives for today. Let's see if these are understandable, if they seem reasonable, and if they have anything to do with what you've said your own objectives are. First of all, we want to identify some common meanings or definitions or usages of the terms stakeholders and stakeholder management, and in some instances, distinguish the common uses from perhaps more appropriate uses of these terms. Secondly, we want you to be able to identify some differences between the stakeholder management practices that are formally advocated and those which often actually occur in real practice. These are not always the same. And if we identify the differences, then we're going to be in a better position to have more control over what we're doing and give you an idea of something or some things that stakeholders would more likely appreciate with regard to quote unquote stakeholder management. So, Susan, do we have any responses in the chat?
We do. We have setting expectations. We have customer internal and external. And we have reporting results, reviewing successes and failures. And we have managing expectations.
Okay. So you said setting expectations and managing expectations, right?
Yes.
Okay. So that's important to point out that that's not exactly the same thing. Okay. Very good. Thank you. Anybody have any additional thoughts? What prompted you to attend this session today? Anything in particular that any of you are encountering or anticipate encountering relevant to stakeholder management? So if you share those, and while you're doing that, I'm also going to ask you if, as a stakeholder, you have ever felt that you were being managed, and if so, how did you like it, and why or why not? So we'll let you share those in the chat as well. Anything else pop up in the chat yet? I'm gonna bump forward if not.
Not as of now. I don't know if they're still thinking.
Okay, good. Well, it takes a little bit of time to put responses in. So some of you have kitties. Here's a nice kitty. And this is kind of the attitude that some people have to the term stakeholder management. So just to give you kind of a heads up to the way that this presentation is organized, I've drawn from several sources. And when I'm drawing from a particular source, I identify it at the bottom. Okay? And so this and the next slide are from the Guide to Project Management Body of Knowledge, the PMBOK Guide, 7th edition For those of you who are not aware, Project Management Institute has put out a number of different editions of the Project Management Guide, body of knowledge. And the latest one came out about, I don't know, not long ago. And it's the 7th edition. And it supersedes the 6th, which superseded the 5th, and so forth. Now, we'll talk more about some of the significant differences and what that has to do with stakeholder management, but I've just included here from the glossary the terms in PMBOK 7th edition that deal with stakeholders. By the way, the definition of stakeholder: an individual, group, or organization that may affect, be affected by, or perceive itself to be affected by a decision, activity, or outcome of a project, program, or portfolio. And we'll see a couple of additional definitions, and perhaps you can compare them in your head. And then there's stakeholder analysis, engagement and assessment matrix, and the stakeholder engagement plan, stakeholder performance domain, and the stakeholder register. Okay. Some of you are familiar with BABOK or BABOK or BABOK, the business analysis body of knowledge, and it's on version 3. And definition of stakeholder there is a group or individual with a relationship to the change, the need, or the solution. Okay. Now, I think you can contrast that with what PMBOK said. I don't think they're identical, although they're certainly similar. And BABOK guide goes on to say that stakeholders are often defined in terms of interest in, impact on, and influence over the change. They're grouped based on their relationship to the needs, the changes, and solutions. Okay. Now, each task that the BABOK describes includes a list of stakeholders who are likely to participate in the execution of that task or who will be affected by it. So the BABOK identifies a humongous set of tasks, and each task description includes a list of stakeholders related to that task. So BABOK very much ties stakeholders to business analysis activities. Okay? And they point out that stakeholders are folks that business analysts interact with, and that any stakeholder can be a source of requirements, assumptions, or constraints. They also say that the list of stakeholders in the BABOK is not intended to be exhaustive. Okay? And that for a given stakeholder role, there could be many individuals in many variations who are participating in that role in your own or other projects. And the other side of it is that an individual could fill more than one role. Now, that's what BABOK and PMBOK say about stakeholders. I'm going to offer what I think is a better definition. And I'm not saying that BABOK and PMBOK's definitions are bad. I just think that mine's a little bit clearer and more meaningful. And so, first of all, we identify 3 terms that are often used somewhat interchangeably. So, first is user, and I describe it as anyone who uses the product. And then a customer is anyone who uses or is affected by my work or work product. And following the total quality management scheme of customers, customers can be internal or external. Internal customers can serve other internal customers or ultimately an external customers. And stakeholder, as I define it, is anyone whose opinion of my work or work product matters. And I think that that's probably a little simpler and easier to deal with. Now, the other thing that I don't think BABOK or PMBOK would necessarily disagree with, but they just don't state it, is the relationship among these. So all users are customers, but there can be customers who are not users. For instance, the person who pays for something is definitely a customer, but often they are not personally involved in using what they're paying for. So all users are customers, and all customers are stakeholders, but there can be stakeholders who are not customers. The best example of that would be regulators. So any of you who comes from or are familiar with regulated industries know that regulators are often your main source of requirements. As such, regulators are a very important stakeholder, but generally the regulator would not be a user or a customer except casually or somewhat unrelated to their regulatory role. So they could be stakeholders who are not customers. Now, the critical thing here is that stakeholder is the all-inclusive term. And that's important to realize. Now, some of you are familiar with, possibly even use the term stakeholder requirements. And I'll tell you that BABOK uses that term, but in a slightly different way. Okay? But many people use the term stakeholder requirements and then think of that as somehow different from something else. I'm going to suggest that, in fact, stakeholders, because that's the all-inclusive term, stakeholders are the source of all requirements. And consequently, all requirements are stakeholder requirements, and in turn, therefore, the term stakeholder requirements is really meaningless. It's redundant and it doesn't add any value. By the way, some people use the term stakeholder to mean people who are not users or customers. Okay? I think that that's a misunderstanding and really gets in the way of meaningful understanding, which is why I emphasize that stakeholder is the all-inclusive term. Nobody is being excluded from that. Now, this is from PMBOK 6th edition. And I'm highlighting this distinction because in PMBOK 6 and several editions prior to that, stakeholder management was a specific section of the body of knowledge. With the 7th edition, the PMBOK changed its structuring, and stakeholder management is no longer accorded the same type of attention that it was accorded as its own section. In fact, section 13 of the PMBOK 6. Okay? And so I'm drawing upon the 6th edition for some things that are specifically directed towards stakeholder management. And so they're emphasizing identifying, analyzing, and developing appropriate management strategies for managing stakeholders, for effectively engaging them in project decisions and execution. And then there are 4 sub-processes: identify, plan, manage, and monitor the stakeholder engagement. So a couple of key concepts from the 6th edition. First of all, you say stakeholder identification and engagement should commence as soon as possible after the project charter has been approved, the project manager has been assigned, and the team begins to form. Okay? And that you should pay attention to stakeholder satisfaction and recognize that the key to effective stakeholder engagement is a focus on continuous communication with all stakeholders, okay? Understanding their needs and expectations, and addressing issues as they occur, managing conflicts, and so forth. Now, I hope you can see this. It's kind of a pale orange highlight. I've used that color, and I apologize if it's not showing up as well as I had hoped. I'm torn between what shows up on a printed version versus what's on the screen. And so I've used this orangey color to point out places where, in my perception and experience, there are disconnects between the stuff that you're supposed to be doing and the reasons you're doing it and what people actually do. So, PMBOK says you're there to understand the stakeholders' needs and expectations. But I'm going to suggest that I think the way that stakeholder management gets interpreted is just the opposite. It's not to, or not so much to understand their needs and expectations as to, shall we say, foster appropriate engagement with, in other words, get the stakeholders to do what the project team wants them to do. And I think that that, unfortunately, is often the way that stakeholder management plays out. Okay? Now, in addition, the 6th edition says that stakeholder management is iterative and that identification, prioritization, and engagement should be reviewed and updated routinely. Okay? And they say, and it should be done at the following times. Okay? And they're talking about particular points in the project. Oops, excuse me, where these are typical demarcation points. Okay? But I'm going to suggest that while PMBOK says to do that, in my experience, very often identification, prioritization, especially identification, but also prioritization and engagement tend not to get reviewed and updated nearly as much. And the other issue is whether you should just be paying attention to this at these particular identifiable life cycle points. Now, in addition, BABOK points out some sources of information about who the stakeholders are. So for purposes of identifying the stakeholders, okay, they're saying, look at things like the org chart, look at the business processes. The sponsor should be able to tell you who stakeholders are. There may be contracts that would have some bearing, or anticipated contracts that would have some bearing. And the regulatory bodies may also influence who the stakeholders are. Okay? Shareholders, customers, and suppliers are also considered when searching for external stakeholders. So these are good sources of information. And in many instances, they are, at least in my perception, the only time that information is sought on who the stakeholders are. So, stepping back to my perceptions, I find that the typical place in a project where stakeholders are identified is at the beginning of the project. Okay? And part of the significance of that is that based upon that initial identification of stakeholders, which may or may not be right, may or may not be wrong, probably is not complete, but based on that, project plans, especially related to data gathering involving the stakeholders, tend to be created at that point and tend to be cast in stone or cast in concrete, if you prefer that. And that, at least in my perception, the requirements analysis, which is typically the activity that the stakeholders are involved in, tends not to be adjusted as much or as often as might be warranted. And a lot of that is because, in my experience, one of the most important types of data that is discovered during requirements analysis, requirements elicitation and analysis or discovery. We're not just identifying requirements or data related to requirements, but we're also often identifying additional stakeholders who need to be involved. Okay? That's a critical element of effective data gathering and analysis. And I don't find that BABOK or PMBOK recognized, let alone acknowledge or emphasize that. And I think it's a real shortcoming. And so what's happening is that during the course of requirements discovery, we're also discovering a lot of additional stakeholders. And the significance of this is that overlooked stakeholders, at least in my experience, are usually the biggest cause of missed requirements. Now, missed requirements are often mischaracterized as creep, new or changed requirements. Almost all of creep is not new or changed requirements. It's requirements that have not been identified accurately or adequately. And the biggest reason for that is because the stakeholders from whom we might learn about those requirements have not been identified adequately. Now, in PMBOK, they relate what the project management principles are. So PMBOK 7 shifts from a bunch of activities as in PMBOK 6 to, first of all, a set of project management principles that are intended to guide the behavior of people. And so now one of those principles is effectively engage with stakeholders. Okay? And goes on to say, engage the stakeholders proactively and to the degree needed to contribute to project success and customer satisfaction. Okay? I don't think anybody can argue with that. And they point out that the project teams are also stakeholders, and they engage other stakeholders to understand, consider, communicate, and respond to their interests and needs. So this notion of stakeholder management, I think, tends to deal with or focus on two major aspects. One of them is the mechanics, the data that you keep and the recording of them. The other is the actual managing, which presumably is going to be based to some extent on the data. Hopefully it's going to be based to a large extent on the data, may or may not be. But recognize that the data aspects and the record-keeping aspects tend to be treated in PMBOK and BABOK, and probably in your life as well, separately from the management quote unquote of the stakeholders. Now, in PMBOK 7, and PMBOK 7 includes both what they refer to as the standard for project management, as well as the guide to the body of knowledge. Okay? And so in the 7th edition, PMBOK shifts from referring to stakeholder management to stakeholder engagement, which also happens to be the term that BABOK uses. And so they point out stakeholders can come and go, and the degree of interest, influence, and impact can also change over time. Now, I've highlighted something that I think really tends to get a lot of the emphasis in the PMBOK and BABOK. So stakeholders, especially those with a high degree of influence and who have an unfavorable or neutral view about a project, need to be effectively engaged so that their interests, concerns, and rights are understood. And then the project team can then address these concerns through effective engagement and support, leading to the probability of a successful project outcome. Now, I'm going to suggest that that highlighted area covers a multitude of interpreted behaviors, okay? And that the gist of stakeholder management is very often directed toward stakeholders who are considered to have unfavorable views about the project. Okay? And the stakeholder management is less about understanding them and more about, shall we say, influencing them. Okay? And addressing really is a code word, in my perception, for twisting arms. Okay? So the other part of it is the mechanical part, the data part, determining how, when, how often, and under what circumstances stakeholders want to be and should be engaged. So this is a very legitimate thing to be concerned about, because if you've ever had the experience of being either not informed when you wanted to be informed, or not involved, not asked when you wanted to be asked, or conversely, over-informed or informed in ways that were not comfortable for you, then indeed, manage the administrative aspects of managing communications is a very important and recognizable part of managing stakeholder involvement. Okay, and so the BABOK goes on to say that communication is a key part of engagement, delves deeper to include awareness of the ideas of others, collective sharing, okay, two-way communication, and so forth, okay? That's all dealing with the mechanics of communication, okay? That's what this is dealing with. What to communicate, how to communicate it, how frequently, how much detail, how formally, and so forth. And out of that, a significant part of what is written and done with regard to stakeholder management deals with some kind of a spreadsheet or matrix or form that is used to capture communication preference information, sometimes referred to as a communications preference register. And so for each stakeholder, there's some basic contact information, and then some information about the level of support that that stakeholder might need, the preferred type of communications, and the frequency of each of those preferred types of communications. Now, that's pretty much factual information. Okay. Then when we get into what the BABOK describes as the stakeholder performance domain, this is the activities that are really involved in managing, quote unquote, managing that stakeholder or those stakeholders. Okay. And supposedly the desired outcomes are productive working relationship and stakeholders' agreement with the project objectives, and that the stakeholders are supportive and satisfied. Okay? And those who are not somehow don't negatively impact the project outcomes. Notice that those who are not satisfied, we just don't want them to interfere with us. We're not necessarily satisfying them. And I think that that's a concern. And so there's a multi-step process that is described: identify, understand, analyze, prioritize, engage, and monitor. Okay. And that is iterative to some extent. Okay. And need to understand their feelings, emotions, beliefs, and values. Okay, and analyze the aspects of each stakeholder's position on and perspective of the project. Now, this is tying back to the data that are kept. And so, for instance, it's very common to have a spreadsheet or form of some sort that identifies for each stakeholder the project teams or project managers or business analysts' perceptions of each individual stakeholder with respect to a lot of these particular topics, power and impact and so forth. Now, I'm going to suggest that there might be issues using this type of a register. and there might be issues, especially not just using, but basically exclusively relying on what you've got in your stakeholder register with regard to these particular topics. And if you would put into the chat any issues that you see or that you're familiar with or have been aware of related to the way that stakeholder management often captures and uses information relating to these particular and similar topics. So I'll give you a few seconds to do that. Okay. As you're doing that, I'm going to continue on here because we do have a pile of data here. Okay. And so the BABOK also points out that how one stakeholder relates to some other stakeholder is also an important or could be an important piece of information. Okay. And then they go on to, give us an example. A key business manager is highly influential, but has negative perceptions related to the project. Okay. And so stakeholder management, once again, is very often interpreted as identify the people who are causing you trouble and go do something about that. And very often what you do about it has nothing to do with addressing the reason why that person is not happy with what you're doing. Now, Susan, have we gotten any responses here?
I don't see anything as of yet for this particular question.
Okay. Well, I'm going to leap forward and identify what's perhaps most critical with regard to these somewhat sensitive topics. In all cases, the analysis should be held in confidence by the project team, since the information could be misinterpreted outside the context for analysis. Let's put it a different way. If you've put together a spreadsheet with all kinds of perceptions about the character and power and beliefs and so forth of individual stakeholders, would you really want that stakeholder or any other stakeholder to be aware of what you're saying about them? I think that's a pretty big exposure, and it probably suggests some other changes of mindset that you might want to take into account. So I think that on the one hand, some of these things are indeed factual, and some of them are indeed subjective, and they are important for an analyst or project manager or project team member to be aware of. But they carry with them some real other issues that you probably need to be more sensitive to. And if you don't want somebody to see this, then maybe you have to rethink this. Make sense? So now, engage. Working collaboratively with stakeholders to introduce the project, elicit their requirements, manage expectations, resolve issues, negotiate, prioritize, problem solve, and make decisions. And somebody at the beginning talked about, where'd my cursor go? Managing expectations. Now, notice, once again, the interpretation that is most likely, and certainly the one that I've seen, is that managing expectations to the manager means influencing the stakeholder to expect what you want them to expect. Whereas I think what the stakeholder wants is for the project team to understand what the stakeholder expects and then deliver it. And I think that that's two diametrically opposed things. Okay. Point out that the PMBOK points out that engagement goes deeper than pushing or pulling communication, includes an exchange of information. Okay? And once again, I'll suggest that while the PMBOK says it's an exchange of information, the way that many, if not most, interpret this is that it's I communicate to the stakeholders what it is that they ought to do, in my opinion. Okay? And I think that that's the gist of why stakeholder management is a term and a concept that is often objected to. Okay? But indeed, there should be feedback, and it should be quick, about the degree to which the stakeholder heard it. Now, determining if they agree with the message is part of it, but what really gets done under the name stakeholder management too often is trying to make the stakeholders agree with your message. And that's usually done in the absence of suitable listening and understanding about the stakeholders' own interests and concerns. Now, final step is monitoring. And some of that is monitoring who the stakeholders are currently. Some stakeholders may drop by the wayside, others may be added. Okay, their attitudes and power and so forth can also change. Okay, and the nature and amount and effectiveness of your quote unquote stakeholder engagement also needs to be examined. Okay. Now, part of that is how satisfied are the stakeholders? So stakeholders can be satisfied and yet not have their needs met. Okay, that's one of the ironies. People often express satisfaction when they shouldn't, and sometimes express dissatisfaction when they shouldn't. So sometimes you give them as good as it can be, and it's not good enough for them. And other times they're perfectly happy with stuff that frankly is not very worthwhile. Okay? And can the stakeholder engagement approach be updated to achieve higher stakeholder satisfaction? Yes. Okay. So you need to monitor what's going on, and some of the things that you're looking at and acting on is, are the right people, including subject matter experts who are stakeholders as well as others, are they participating effectively? Are their attitudes and interests staying constant or improving? And by improving, they mean changing to what you want them to think. Are we confirming what we're eliciting? Are we getting agreements and commitments, and are they being upheld? Okay. And some other things that we tend to be attuned to: what happens when stakeholders are no longer paying sufficient attention to our project, or whether the quality of the information that we are obtaining is just not suitable. And one of the things that we often see as a symptom of ineffective communications is that people who should be approving, or not should be, but are responsible for approving things, tend to be delayed. Now, they could be delayed because we haven't provided them everything that they need. They could be delayed because what we've provided them is not what they're after, or they don't understand it, or it doesn't make sense, or what have you. So there's a lot of reasons, but the delay in approval is a symptom, key performance indicator. So let me just shift gears and see if we can put some of this stuff together. So first of all, stakeholders, the all-inclusive term, are the source of all requirements, okay? And those requirements relate to the stakeholders' business needs, the stakeholders' business problems, and the value, the business value that the stakeholders are looking to accomplish. And through an interactive process of integrated discovery and analysis, we identify high-leveled and detailed, what I call real business or stakeholder or user requirements. Okay. Now, those are business deliverable what's that when delivered or satisfied provide value. And I've separated out the term user because the term user requirements is often used to mean something different. These indeed are the requirements of the user, the business requirements, the things that will provide value when they are met. But the reason that I've split this out is because in the use case community, and use cases are a format for documenting requirements, and we'll see where they fit in a second, many people in the use case community refer to the use cases as the user requirements. And I'm going to suggest that while use cases can be user requirements, they usually are not. So the real business stakeholder user requirements are business deliverable what's that provide value when they are satisfied. Products and their related system software requirements, typically described in terms of features, are ways how to respond to satisfying the what's. And product requirements are often broken down into functional requirements and non-functional requirements. And there are two common formats for documenting or capturing functional requirements. One of them is a software requirement specification. In other words, a statement that typically starts with the system shall such and such. That's a software or product requirement. The other format is a use case, a step-by-step description of how a user interacts with the system. As such, the use case is not the user's requirements. Rather, the use case is the expected usage requirements of that expected product, system, or software. And then going along with that are non-functional requirements. Okay? And I will encourage you not to use the term non-functional requirements because it is misleading. These are relevant only with regard to functionality, and that some people refer to them as quality requirements. That's not quite true either, because the major component of quality is functionality, but quality factors, quality attributes, or just attributes, or the term that I prefer is ilities, because ilities actually captures what these are without conveying any additional meanings. Many of these are terms that end in ility, like usability and reliability and maintainability and durability and so forth. Now, because of that, the group of them is often referred to as ilities. Be aware that there are also ilities such as performance and security that don't end in ility, but they are still ilities. Okay? And a use case either does not identify the ilities, in which case we've got a problem, or they identify them in a separate related document, typically called a supplementary requirement specification. Okay? Because the use case itself doesn't have a place to capture all of these ilities requirements. Be that as it may, the project process responds to the product system software requirements from an engineering or technical standpoint, starting with a high-level engineering design of how those product features are going to be accomplished, and then driving that down to more detail into a detailed or technical engineering design. And that in turn is what a developer then codes from and implements. If you are involved in Agile, you're probably using user stories. Now, this is a much bigger topic than we can get into here. I've spoken on user stories in prior great IT professional talks, and refer you to them, or I have seminars and training and consulting on these as well. But when done appropriately, user stories should be a real business requirement, representing a real business requirement. And one of the main reasons why I'm able to say that, because the user story includes as one of its essential elements the value to be obtained when the user story is satisfied. Now, in Agile, the user stories are the starting points for an Agile project. And then the Agile team, or project team, engages in conversations to determine what that user story really means and how it can be accomplished in working code. Now, notice the conversations in Agile take the place of all of this other elaboration. May or may not succeed. There are other issues with it. It's beyond what I can get into here. But once again, we do address these in our user stories, consulting and training. Now, here's the point that I want to raise to tie this together. Meaningful stakeholder engagement comes from accurately understanding the stakeholders' real business requirements. Okay? The business deliverable what's that provide value. Okay? Too many projects start with trying to design the product, system, or software that they're going to build. Okay? User stories should be describing real business requirements. Too many user stories, in fact, are describing product features to be built. Okay? And then those product features get built and they turn out not to provide the intended value. So understanding, discovering the real business requirements involves a meaningful communication. Okay? Listening, not imposing. Okay? That's the real secret. So tying this back together again, I think we've talked about some common meanings and hopefully some more appropriate meanings of stakeholder and stakeholder management. We've looked at some differences between what the business analysis and project management bodies of knowledge describe as desired practices and what people actually often do instead. And I've suggested that the key to stakeholders more likely appreciating what's going on is when the project is actually endeavoring to understand and address from the stakeholder's perspective what the stakeholder wants and needs to get value. This is a diagram of some of the courses in consulting that I do, okay, including over here on the left, defining and managing real business requirements, and writing agile user stories and writing agile user story acceptance tests. Okay? And we've got things like proactive user acceptance testing and other courses in training and consulting that also tie to this. If you want to know more about that, please don't hesitate to contact me. This is a pack of lies about me, and you're welcome to contact me or ask about anything that we've discussed or not discussed. And so I'll hand it back over to Susan.
Robin, we thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, everybody. And if I can be of more assistance, don't hesitate to contact me.